Hey guys, so with 2023 about to conclude, I thought I'd go through some of the premier level events throughout this entire year just to map out, some of the trends in terms of the best, most popular hand traps and just in terms of general commentary with, what the hand trap trend might look like moving forward into early next year. So definitely, before we continue, go check out my discount codes for Yu-Gi-Oh! Singles or supplies or sealed product. You'll find all of the information in the video description below. So in terms of the timelines of events that are included for this video, basically spanning from January to December of this year, starting with YCS Sydney. Now keep in mind that basically the events included for this video is essentially dependent on whether I actually cover those events in terms of the top cut breakdowns of the most played hand traps and staples that I usually do. And for the most part, I usually cover most of them. There are times where, let's say, there's just not enough topping deck lists that were available, which happens to be the case for a lot of South American events, unfortunately. And also sometimes you have a ban list that's about to come into effect, and there's a premier event just before that, in which case I did not cover because I know there wouldn't be any interest for, a quote-unquote dying format. So let's just get into the number of hand traps in the main deck in terms of median number, and we're actually starting off with 12 right from January. This is YCS Sydney, and this is actually during that tier 0 format, which honestly feels like a really long time ago. This is basically what the topping pie charts used to look like back in those days. So now 12 is a very high number, but keep in mind it is slightly misleading, and that is because if you recall, something like Kelbeck was actually counted as a hand trap because it is a hand trap, right? It actually has a bounce effect, and it was played in 3. You also have things like Orange Heralds, and also not to mention just a lot of Bystials that were mandatory at that point. So it does inflate the hand trap count quite a bit, but and also your quote-unquote traditional hand traps like Ash, Nibiru, like those were not seeing that much play during this time. Now of course with that ban list that came into effect, limiting the tier names, the Shizu cards, we do see a drastic decline in the median number of hand traps, although we actually saw an increase in terms of again those quote-unquote traditional hand traps like Ash and Nibiru and Droll and what have you. So at this point, you have of course Kashira being like the best deck. Branded and Labyrinth were also going very strong during this February time. That was YCS Vegas 3v3 event, and since then it was kind of stable, and then you see that huge uptick in May at 11, right? So can you guess why that is? And the hint is Cyberstorm Access. And so of course if you recall, we had Super Heavy Samurai and also Pearly got a buff in that set as well. And of course with Super Heavy Samurai you really needed to have Droll for that matchup just because of how bonkers it is in terms of the board that it sets up, and it does search quite a lot. So that's why you saw that big uptick, and then right after unfortunately that ban has happened in May, I believe, and so you also had basically Super Heavy Samurai got a really big hit just after 3 weeks of meta relevance. Pearly even got a little bit of a hit, so you do see that median number drop, but then since then it's been kind of stable at around 9, which I guess is a little bit higher compared to last year, which I believe was around 6 to 8 for the most part. And I'm sure moving into the next format in early next year at least, I'm sure it will at least stay pretty stable. I mean, you do still have like Labyrinth, Ash, Bell, even Bystials are going to be still good against them. You still have Fire Kings, and so just right now I think we're still in kind of a hand trap format. Next, let's cover the median number of hand traps in the side deck, and this one's kind of an interesting trend because we actually start around just 3, which is kind of normal actually from previous years as well, from the early days of this year during that tier 0 format, and steadily creeping towards around 6. Of course, you have things like, let's say, like Nibiru or Droll, which are maybe more format or rather matchup dependent rather than, something like Asher Imperm, which are very generic. So maybe that's part of the reason you of course have Bystial still primarily in the side deck unless you're playing like Dragon Link, of course. So I think this is kind of an interesting trend, and who knows, maybe it'll still stick around at that point. So now let's just cover specific popular hand traps and kind of cover their trends as well throughout this entire year, starting with Ash Blossom, which for the most part is usually number 1 throughout the years that I've been doing these top cut breakdowns. But early this year, and of course kind of like at the end of last year as well, during that tier 0 format, like Ash, Imperm, like Nibiru, like those traditional hand traps were not seeing that much play during that time. But of course right after that ban list, and you have of course Branded and Labyrinth emerging as again tier 1 contenders, Ash quickly became the most played hand trap again, reclaiming its title, and it, for the most part, has been steady around 1st and 2nd. Recently it kind of fell a little bit, losing its top spot to something like Nibiru or Droll. So that's remains to be seen in terms of moving into next year. Ash will obviously still see a lot of play. Labyrinth is going to be, because it was not hit, going to be essentially one of the best, if not the best deck moving to the next format. And Ash on Welcome or Big Welcome can be big. Fire Kings is another really good deck. Ash can hit a lot of those, or a lot of plays on that deck, as well as Rescue Ace Emergency is always nice to hit with Ash. And of course Branded, they did not get hit either in terms of the ban list, so Ash will always go strong against that strategy. So next we have Imperm, which honestly, during that tier 0 format, this was probably like the only quote-unquote traditional hand trap that still saw a pretty good amount of play, just because Imperm on the Kikalas was actually quite strong. But since then, honestly, has been pretty stable at kind of being like the 3rd most played hand trap. I mean, it is very generic. It's very useful even even going second as well. Even right now, in particular, you have things like Imperm, Veiler, even Ghost Mourner. Those effect negation cards that's being pretty important because of Rescue Ace Sephora with Turbulence. Obviously, moving into the next format, we still have Rescue Ace. They got a mana hit. Labyrinth, obviously, Imperm is not very good against them. I guess you have like Fire Kings emerging now, and Imperm can be pretty good against them as well. Against something like Minidium, I don't think it's enough, but you know what? At least it's there. So next we have Nibiru, which of course during the tier 0 days with that iteration of tier elements, honestly Nibiru was not that very good because, you know, of course they were all playing Rocalis during that time, you know, Kit Kalos was legal, and so Nibiru was not really going to resolve, and the second best deck during that time, by a long shot of course, was Sprite, and against Sprite Nibiru was also not very good unless you had another hand trap paired with it. But since then, you know, once that ban list came into effect, and then you had Kashyyyr being the best deck and the most popular deck, Nibiru of course was consistently seeing an increase in play, and then you also see another increase around that fall time, around September, like YCS Vancouver time, because of course Unchained at this point has been established as like one of the better decks of the format alongside Kashyyyr, and Nibiru is also good against that strategy as well. And then since then, it's actually very recently been really popular. Actually, in November, tied for first along with Droll, and then most recently in YCS Bologna was actually the most played hand trap. And I kind of made a comment on it during that video where I was I mean, I understand Nibiru is good, but I was a little surprised I was actually the most played hand trap. Moving into early next year, again, against Labyrinth, it's not going to be very good, but against, you know, Rescue Ace is still going to be around, and Nibiru can be quite good against them. Of course, they can kind of play things around with like SP and everything, but you know what, for the most part, I think Nibiru is still here to stay. So next we have Droll and Lockbird, which is really format dependent, of course. So again, early in the year, just was not very good. Even after the tier 0 format, you had things like, you know, Branded and also Labyrinth, which Droll was not really good against those strategies. So that's why it did not see that much play. But, you know, in May, it really saw a huge uptick. And again, as I mentioned earlier, that is when Super Heavy Samurai, you know, people were very fearful of it, and they felt, you know, the need for Droll because that deck is just insane when left uninterrupted and going first. But then again, right after that, I kind of saw a dip, and then it just kind of goes up and down. So of course, you know, during like August, Kashyyyr and Pearly, they were still like the better decks, and Dragon Link was still around as well. And then most recently November, you know, I think a lot of players were also respecting like Minidium, especially because that deck is also insane if left uninterrupted. So but recently kind of fell down again. I think it's still pretty strong. Of course, I should also mention, you know, against like Rescue Ace and tier elements, Droll can be pretty good against them in the right situations as well. I think for now, people are probably a little hesitant to take Droll out of their side deck or main deck or whatever, just because sometimes they just get heavily punished when they go against something like Minidium or like some combo heavy oriented deck. So I think for now it's probably here to stay, but kind of interesting considering this trend. Probably see a bit of a decline again at some point. Next, we're moving on to Vec Veiler, which again, similar to like Imperm, as I mentioned earlier, because of something like Turbulence and Rescue Ace set 4, Vec Veiler recently has seen a lot more popularity in play, and also something like Pearly, where, you know, they draw off Sleepy Memory. They do need something like, they prefer something like Veiler than drawing into like an Imperm, just because they would control cards at that point, and Veiler can be quite useful. So again, this is another card, as long as Rescue Ace is around, and you know what, while it does play into talents like Effect Negation, it's always going to at least have some kind of application against every deck, so I think it's still, again, another card that's here to stay for now. Next, we have Gamma, which is kind of an interesting one, right? Because at one point, you know, especially during that May 2023 format, again, Super Heavy Samurai, because there's a lot of Droll being played, Super Heavy Samurai, they were all playing Gamma to make sure that they can kind of resolve and like go through their combos. Of course, then right after that, Gamma got hit to 1, and that is why you just see a complete tank in terms of play. So for the most part, you know, at just 1, like you're not really gonna see this card being played. Sometimes I've seen Labyrinth still play it. Even like Dragon Link, they have that one Red Eyes guy that like dumps the Gamma, or rather Driver, so they also play like the 1 Gamma, but for the most part I think it's kind of gone in terms of, you know, popularity. Next, we have DD Crow. This is another one where, for the most part, for the entire year, really was not seeing that much play. Like, even in the beginning of the year, you know, you had basically Tier Limits was the most only relevant deck around, and at that point, you might as well just play Bestials anyways. Recently, though, it saw some popularity because, A, it can, of course, hit things like, you know, spells and traps. So you can hit, like, those Pearly quick play spells to kind of stop them from Exceed Summoning. And even against, like, something like Fire Kings now in the most recent era is that, of course, they're fire, so Bestials are not going to do anything. So at least you can crow away like whatever they're trying to come back, because they are kind of relying on coming back from the graveyard as well. So I'm sure this card will still at least see a decent amount of play moving into early next year as well, especially against something like Labyrinth, where, you know, when you banish any of their cards, like realistically they don't have any in-engine way to get them back. So next we have Shifter, which of course never really ranks that high in terms of play, just because not many decks can actually play, right, and play optimally. You know, not every deck is like Flunder or Kashtira, for example. So even during that tier 0 format at the beginning of the year, where Shifter is, you know, primarily for tier elements, of course, because tier elements made the vast majority of the top cut, that's why, you know, in terms of, because they're not playing Shifter, that's why it's never really ranked that high. And throughout the year, it was never really rated, played that much, just because of, in terms of, you know, relatively speaking, among the topping deck lists are actually able to play Shifter. Not many, and even in the most recent event in Bologna, it was actually saw a bit of a decline as well, because you even used to have like decks like, you know, Pearly, Rescue, they were even siding Shifter for like that tier element matchup, but the most recent month, they weren't even doing that, and now with tier elements actually being hit quite hard with the Guido and Kelbeck bans, who knows how much Shifter would see play, at least among decks where, you know, like again, something like Pearly and Rescue, where they don't play optimally under Shifter, but they can play it. But now there's not really a reason to, just because tier elements is gone, but I could be wrong. But, you know, hopefully this card still does get hit in some fashion in the future ban list. And then we have Ghost Spell. This is always an interesting one, because I find if it's ever popular, it doesn't last for very long. This kind of happened last year as well. But for the most part, you know, at one point it kind of saw a decent amount of play in like the summer. You know, you still had, let's say like Labyrinth was seeing a good amount of play. And then, you know, Branded, like Ghost Spell can be good, but if they have like Branded Lost, you know, it's really hit or miss, right? Like under Lost, you're just never really going to be able to bell. So that's why it was kind of good, but sometimes bad against Branded. And anyways, in the summer, it was seeing a good amount of play, particularly for those decks, but we really saw a big tank in terms of play. But recently kind of saw a bit of it play, and now with, you know, again, Labyrinth being presumably like one of the best, if not the best deck, and Ghost Spell on Big Welcome is going to be very strong, so people might kind of experiment this again. And also, I guess against Fire King, it probably comes up too, because they again kind of come back from the grave. So I'm pretty curious to see what's going to happen with this one next year. And then finally, rounding off, we do have some of the Bystials, most notably Magnum, and let's just cover Druism as well, because they basically show like the exact same trends. Of course, during that tier 0 format earlier in this year, it like really was a must-play hand trap, and just by far the most played hand trap, of course. And then right after that ban list, a huge tank in terms of play, because again, Kashtira was like the best deck. Like, what are you really Bystialing? Of course, but now, you know, you also have like Labyrinth, and then you have also something like Unchained popping up, tier elements coming back, and that's why you kind of see that increase in play of Bystials again around like, let's say, October time. And now even in December, we're still seeing a good amount of play. And now with Labyrinth not being hit on the ban list, while yes, tier elements are kind of gone for now, and at least in terms of tier 1, tier 2 conversations, but I think, you know, because of Labyrinth, and Bystials can be very good, not only to banish their monsters to prevent them from recurring, but just to interrupt that time window for like the lady set. I think Bystials will still stick around for early next year as well. Alright guys, so that was it for the overview of the most played and most popular hand traps throughout this entire year. Hopefully you found that interesting and fun to watch in terms of the history. Anyways, a huge thanks to all of you for watching. A big thanks to my patrons as always for the continued support, and well, take care guys, and Happy New Year.